Hey everybody, this is Dan from Z-Band. I'm a minute or two early here, so we'll wait a couple of minutes until we get started. What I'm going to do today is we're going to go through, I decided to add HDR to the presentation, mainly because we get a lot of questions about it, and it's something that I wanted to make sure everybody understood. As we're going through this, want to be really clear here that there's not going to be a lot of this presentation in particular that is Z-Band specific. This is going to be really generic to what's going on in the industry at this point in time and what we kind of think future trends are. And then at the end, I've got, I think, 5 or 7 different articles that people can go through and read on their own. Did want to say at this point that we do a survey at the end of each of these presentations. When I close the survey, or when I close the session, the survey should pop up on your screen. So when things are wrapping up, please don't run off to your next meeting immediately. If you could stick around and do the survey, that would be greatly appreciated. We did have pretty close to 100 registrants for this session. So I'm going to wait a minute or two here for some additional people to trickle in, and then we'll go. If at any point in time you have questions, please put them into the questions chat box, which should be in your GoToMeeting tool panel. And yeah, we'll get those answered at the end, or if I'm missing something really obvious and really stupid, I will jump on them right as the question comes in. But I do keep that kind of popped out throughout the majority of the presentation. So I'm going to give everybody another minute or two to trickle in, and then we will get rolling talking about 4K, 8K, and HDR video and what exactly they are and how they work. All right, I'm gonna go. So to start this off, 4K, 8K, and HDR. Didn't think it was appropriate to jump directly into talking about how they're being utilized and where they're at in broadcast trends without getting a little bit of a head start on what exactly they are. So the first slide that I have here is when we're talking about 4K, 8K, and those types of video, even talking about traditional 1080, what we're discussing are video resolutions, and they are governing the number of pixels that you are able to view on whatever it is that your screen is. And I want to be clear about this because we have some customers that tend to get this twisted. There's a relationship between H.265 and 4K, and there's a relationship between H.264 and standard 1080p video, but these are not interchangeable terms, right? Just because you have an H.265 encoder doesn't mean you have 4K video quality. Just because you have 4K video quality doesn't mean that you have H.265 or HEVC compression. Actually, it's the case in the US right now that most of the 4K content that you're getting through Amazon, Netflix, Hulu, those types of technologies is actually still being transmitted to you in H.264. The H.265 is not as widely accepted and as widely deployed by the industry as what H.264 is. So even though people will use these terms interchangeably, it's HEVC, so it must be 4K. Like that's not how that works. The 4K is a resolution that is discussing the number of pixels or representing the number of pixels that are on your screen. And HEVC, H.264, H.265, those are compression standards. So they're related entities, but they're completely separate entities. And I want to be clear about that because we do have a lot of customers that will juxtapose them interchangeably in a conversation, and that's not how it works. So just as a quick overview, when we're talking about resolution, standard 720 video, so a 1080 by 720 TV screen, most of your TVs that are a few years old or 35 inches and smaller, this is kind of their default resolution. Actually, there's quite a lot of broadcast content these days that this is still the standard resolution that's sent out. Has just under a million pixels. And a pixel is one of the little tiny squares on the screen that is containing the video information for that particular square. So it's going to be a certain color, right? And it's important to note that within that pixel, there's no like separation of color dynamics. So if you're watching old 480 content on a brand new HD screen and you have little blocky images, or you pause the video and the line between that person's sweater vest and their neck, or a sweater vest and their undershirt is a little, you can see the jagged edges of it. That is, you're actually looking at the individual pixels as they've been created. So that pixel is that little segment of video on the screen that is showing you it's containing video information, but it's specific just to itself. It's not going to govern what's going on in any of the squares around it. So a million pixels, or 921,000 pixels, is a lot of video. If we bump up to 1080 resolution, we actually double the number of pixels, or more than double the number of pixels that are on the screen. So to over 2 million pixels in a 1080 screen. And really, almost any TV that you get on the market today is definitely capable of doing 1080. All the new ones are also capable of doing 4K as well. I did put one bullet point on here. This is why that the people that like stream 4K video to their phone are simply doing nothing more than wasting bandwidth. Because as we'll see as we get into the next slide here, 4K is 3,840 pixels across by 2160 pixels up and down for, I think that goes to just over 8 million pixels. Your phone does not need to display 8 million pixels to watch 4K video on the phone. It just doesn't. So this is a thing that people will talk to us about, and I want to be really clear about that. Like, you don't need 4K video on your phone. Actually, if you have a television that is 47 inches or under, you don't need 4K video on that TV. The 2 million pixels that you get with standard 1080 video are enough on the smaller televisions that you don't need to go down the path of spending the additional money for a 4K capable television. It's not an effective use of anyone's economic resources. The thing with 4K, though, is it is definitely the buzzword in the industry, and it's definitely the direction that all of the content creators are taking their current content, right? If you watch Game of Thrones, 4K capability, House of Cards, 4K. I have a couple of examples for broadcast. I don't want to steal my own thunder, but there's a lot more content being created in 4K, and this is a focus of a lot of the broadcast providers and content creators across the United States. One of the issues and one of the challenges with 4K, which is why we don't all have like 4K TVs sitting in our living rooms or in every patient room of every healthcare facility or every hotel bed across the U.S., is it's really, really big, right? Every couple of minutes of uncompressed 4K video is 500 gigabits of data. So we don't think about it from a distribution standpoint, but when you think about how this content is actually being created, it's got to be captured by a 4K camera, it's got to be stored on a server, it's got to be edited, it's got to be processed. So there's a ton of storage that's required to create this initial 4K content. And then what you have is this massive file size that to distribute it at 60 frames per second is almost 3 gigs of data. And that's problematic, right? Because we still have a ton of customers who their network backbone is 1 gig or maybe they have a network backbone that's 10 gig, but they don't want to dedicate a third of their network to broadcasting a single video source. And then a standard QAM channel or APS-C channel in the US is 6 megahertz wide and only supports 38.8 megabits per second of data. So there's absolutely no way right now with the infrastructure that we have to distribute 4K video in the United States uncompressed. It just can't be done. The raw image quality is too large for any of the distribution mechanisms that we have to support 4K video. So knowing that it's better, right, because you have 4 times the pixels, over 8 million pixels, and knowing that content creators are all going this direction, but it's really hard to distribute, what are we doing and how are we using it? The biggest applications that we have right now in the US specifically are in digital signage. So there's a ton of digital signage manufacturers that are out there that are allowing you to create and distribute your content in 4K. Some of those are media player devices, and then those media players are a direct HDMI connection or DVI connection to a display device. There are also some manufacturers that are out there that are doing direct fiber connection. So you create the content comes out HDMI or DVI, and then you feed into a device that will do a direct fiber run to a television or a display. It doesn't have to be a TV since we're HDMI only. It can just be like an NEC display. And it'll pull that digital signage content in 4K to one or many sources. HD-based is a technology that we're seeing that's doing a lot of this 4K video transmission because it's a single HDMI source into an HD-based transmitter, and then that is using all 8 pins of the category cable to distribute the uncompressed 4K video out to a receive device or multiple receive devices, and then back to HDMI to display at the television. And then I didn't put it in a category. I kind of lumped it in here with digital signage because it's a direct to display device connection. Blu-ray discs are very common 4K sources. You can get a lot of 4K video on Blu-ray these days. That's another option for moving 4K video around. But this is, I just want to be really clear on this point, this is by far the largest part of the industry today in terms of having the infrastructure and the bits and pieces to display 4K. There's much more ready to roll in digital signage than we are in broadcast. The other place that is quickly catching up and is going to overtake the signage side of things is your OTT streaming, right? So Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, YouTube, I believe my Roku boxes at home have their own dedicated 4K channel where you can just watch 4K videos of mountains and animals and whatever it is. I think they have some oddball ones like people snowboarding and some of those types of things. But there are video channels that you can get on most of these streaming services or streaming platforms now that are designed just to show off the additional quality of 4K and what you can do and how much better the details are and the background is with a 4K video versus a traditional 1080 video. The issue that you run into with OTT streaming of 4K and streaming of 4K in general, and will be an even larger problem at the end of the presentation when we get into 8K, is bandwidth, right? Because what we have is this raw file that's 3 gigabits per second at 60 frames, and we need to compress that down into something that the average US user can consume. It needs to be under that 38.8 meg limit for QAM distribution to get it out to a TV system. So we have to do a massive amount of compression to actually distribute this video. And this is true whether we're going to distribute this video as RF in a QAM stream, which we'll jump onto next, or whether we're going to distribute this video as IP, right? Because I'm not sure about everyone else. I live in a reasonably sized town in Maryland. I have a 100 meg data pipe that comes into my house, which still falls about 97% short of what I would need to actually, pull raw, uncompressed 4K video into my house. So even your Netflix, your Hulu, your Amazon, this is a compressed version of the 4K video that you're getting. And I see a question pop in, so I'm going to pause here to take a look at this question page. Oh, that's a great one. Sorry, Ernie. OTT. I used that acronym, and I apologize. I just jumped into an assumption there. OTT is over the top, and broadly, that's the industry term for any content that you are getting that is sourced via the internet. So Netflix is an over-the-top streaming service. Amazon Prime Video is an over-the-top streaming service. HBO Go is an over-the-top streaming service. Anything that where you're sourcing that video content directly from the internet itself. I mean, the first one and the one that we're all familiar with is YouTube, right? But no, Netflix and Disney Plus, obviously with the launching this week, are winning that war in terms of names. So when I use OTT, that's to any of those over-the-top streaming services that are coming directly to you without using any broadcast provider as an intermediary, is what I'm referring to there. So thanks, Ernie. That was a good question. Sorry that I spoke over everyone's head on that one. My bad. Back to where I was, the incoming pipe for most people doesn't support the ability to stream directly 4K. So the video has to be compressed. And there are purists out there, video creation purists, who will tell you that as soon as you're compressing that video, and what compression does, and I think I covered this on the previous webinar, is it really creates an estimation of the video that you're getting, right? So it guesses as what motion is and color was, because it's got to reduce. You have to lose some data in order to actually compress video. There are purists out there that will tell you that as soon as this 4K video is compressed, what you get on the receive end is no longer actually 4K video, but it's a dumbed down estimation of 4K video, which doesn't really go well for a marketing campaign if you're a TV manufacturer. So they're definitely not going to tell you that. And I don't know where I stand on that particular debate, to be frank about it. So you do see down there at the end, Amazon's going to require at least 15 megabits as a dedicated connection. Netflix wants 25 is their recommendation, and that is just simply to get one single 4K video stream. Forget it if many people in your household are actually trying to watch 4K. Then you're going to be using almost 100 meg of data for 4 people to watch a 4K video content on separate devices. And again, please don't make one of those devices your phone. It doesn't matter. The other thing that we're getting here and starting to see being driven is APS-C 3.0, which is actually going to allow your local service providers, your local CBS, NBC, ABC station, to broadcast 4K over the air directly to your house. And this is becoming relevant because we live in this age where I go out and we sell TV services for a living, and most of the people that I talk to are cord cutters, right? They have Sling TV or DirecTV Now, or I guess it's AT&T now. Hulu with the live streaming service, YouTube Live TV, and then a handful of them will throw an antenna up on the roof so that they can pick up some live channels when they want to, or get the local broadcast of. I'm in the DC suburbs, so I'm going to say the Redskins game, although that's been pretty woeful this year, so maybe not. But anyway, where this matters is now you're going to be able to get 4K content over the air from your local service provider directly into your living room with just an antenna on the roof and a connection on your TV. Where that's problematic is this is not a backwards compatible standard. This is a brand new methodology for video distribution. So it's going to require new content from the service providers. It is going to require new equipment on the service provider side of things. And it is going to require new equipment in your house to pull this APS-C 3.0 content. So this over-the-air broadcast that you can pull the local CBS station in 4K, and it's a 4K broadcast, is great, and it's here, and it's going to be continue to roll out through 2019 and 2020. But it is going to require the purchase of equipment, and there's a limited amount right now of ATSC 3.0 capable tuners, external tuners, for you to just plug one in next to your TV and have another HDMI. And your standard OTT devices, right, your Roku boxes, all those types of things don't have a tuner at all. So you're not getting that over-the-air ATSC content. With your streaming services, you're talking about two separate devices, two separate tuners in order to support that local broadcast content and your over-the-top streaming services. So it's incredibly efficient for a hospital or a hotel that wants to be able to broadcast content in 4K, because it's going to require a direct ATSC tuner. So there's going to be device or equipment that's required. So the other piece that we have here in the broadcast space is actually broadcasting 4K in a QAM package directly from the service provider, rather than going from the local broadcast station. Where we're seeing this, there's not a ton of it in the U.S. yet. Actually, the first NFL 4K broadcast from Fox earlier this year was the Packers versus Eagles on September 26th. They also did a lot of Major League Baseball. There is more and more of this coming out all the time. Some of the Premier League soccer matches that you can watch on NBC are created and broadcast in 4K, mainly because they're not actually sending NBC cameras over there. They're just redistributing what Sky or one of the other folks is grabbing. And where you see it most commonly in North America, the earliest adopter was all Major League Baseball home games of the Toronto Blue Jays have been available for broadcast in 4K since 2017. So we are starting to see this come out now amongst broadcasters in the U.S. And what they're doing is they're taking that 4K stream and they're compressing it down into something that is under 38.8 megabits so that it can be distributed out in a QAM package. And there are modulators. There's starting to be modulators on the market now that you can do this. Pro Video Instruments has one. Blonder Tongue has one. There's a handful of other manufacturers that are doing full 4K video distribution and then able to modulate that content into an Agile channel of your choice. This is my only Z-band bit of this presentation, is because this is something that we get as a common question. Your Z-band system, as you have it now, or as you're looking at implementing it, depending on where you're at in your implementation cycle, will support 4K. There's nothing in the Z-band system that does anything to affect the video quality, the resolution. It is just passing whatever is in that 38.8 meg QAM stream. It's doing nothing more or less than that. So your Z-band system will support 4K, the same as it supported 1080, the same as it supports analog. There's nothing there. But expect to see more of this coming. Again, not to steal my own thunder for later in the presentation, but this is definitely a focus of the broadcast providers. And even though we've heard this, I think one of the articles that I have in the links is from like 2016. Even though we've heard this term 4K for quite some time, this is still in the midst of happening, specifically in the U.S. Because the broadcasters went through this analog to digital transition in the mid to late 2000s, and then spent millions upon millions of dollars across the country to upgrade broadcast studios, cameras, and storage systems, and so on and so forth. And now 4K comes along, and they have to do the same thing, right? They have to upgrade their camera. They have to upgrade their storage, because 4K video is 4 times as large, so each file requires 4 times as much storage, and they have to upgrade their transmission equipment. And this is a slow rollout, because a lot of the money that was invested just to get broadcasters up to HD, they don't want to do that every 5 years just to keep up with whatever the latest transmission standard would be. So we're seeing 4K roll out. And we are seeing it become a part of broadcast, but still the high majority of broadcast content that you're getting in the U.S. is in that 720 to 1080 range. 4K content directly from a service provider is the exception right now, and not the rule. What I decided to throw in here, and you can see it on the screen at this point, is a quick discussion on HDR, high dynamic range, because it goes hand in hand with 4K a lot of the time, and it's a question that we get in terms of what HDR is. And I want to be really clear here, because until I started doing the research to do this webinar, I didn't realize this. The HDR that you get on your phone when you take an HDR picture is not the same as what we're talking about when you're talking about HDR, high dynamic range video. What your phone or what your camera is actually doing to create, I'll keep it specific to the phone. What your phone is doing when it creates an HDR picture for you is it's taking multiple pictures of that same image and basically giving it different exposures, several different exposures, and then simulating what that high dynamic range would be by compiling all those exposures on top of each other to create the HDR image. That is not what is happening with HDR video. With HDR video, you're actually getting a higher contrast ratio. You're getting more realistic colors. The red of a fire truck is more red. The deep dark green of a leaf in a forest is more true to that deep dark green. What HDR is supposed to do in the video world is give you a more accurate representation of what that image looks like in real life. It's not pulling out these colors and providing this crazy high contrast. It is supposed to get closer and closer and closer to an emulation of if you're standing in your backyard and taking a picture of the fall foliage. What you see on the screen should get pretty close to matching what you see when you're standing in your backyard with the HDR side of things. And this is, again, where it applies to Z-band, or where it applies to the industry writ large, is this is specially created content, right? Because the camera that you're using has to be able to capture those increased contrast ratios. The system that you're using, or your system that you're using to decode the content, whether that's a tuner, whether that's a box, whether that's a television, has to be able to display in HDR. Again, because color is everything that we send these days in the world of digital is described in bits and bytes, and we can't send a non-HDR TV the bits and bytes to display this deep, true green that aren't in its library. It'll see those and I don't know what that is, so it just displays regular green, right? So this is the limitation at this point in time, is it does require an HDR content as it's created, and it's going to require HDR on the display device. Where this goes hand in hand with 4K is if you have 4K content, the 4K content is almost always using HDR capable camera for the broadcast. So that 4K capability is embedded in the idea that we're moving to 4K. One of the things about HDR versus non-HDR content is if you are looking at a 1080 video, standard video quality as we get, the most common video quality across the US today, 1080, 720, and one of those pieces is created with HDR and one of those pieces is not created with HDR. The HDR created content is going to look better, to be more pleasing to the human eye than the non-HDR content of the same resolution. And that's really the advantage that you're getting with HDR, is you're getting the look and feel of a higher quality image, of a higher resolution, without actually necessarily bumping up to that next resolution. So we are seeing this. This is a common question. Content is definitely starting to be created this way, but again, same issue as with 4K, is it does require that special capture equipment and special equipment on the receive end to be able to display 4K or to be able to display HDR quality distribution systems. so, or quality video. And it's not resolution dependent, right? It's not a resolution. It is a mechanism of describing color, which sounds weird, but we had this discussion in the office last week that everything around us is zeros and ones these days, even color. So the last bit here is what is 8K, and do we have to worry about it yet? So what is 8K? If we go back to our conversation at the beginning when we were having a discussion on pixels, right? And 720 video is just under 1 million pixels, and 1080 video is just over 2 million pixels. And then 4K video is, over 8 million pixels. Now, when we get to 8K video, we're talking about over 33 million pixels in the image to describe what is being shown on the screen. There is no current broadcast content in the U.S. that is 8K. Most of what we're seeing is people transitioning their broadcast systems to 4K and bringing along more broadcast content in 4K. Forget about 8K itself. Now, and you'll see in the articles that I'll send out as a part of the PowerPoint presentation, in Japan, there's some exceptions to this, right? There are some exceptions in Asia where there are 8K broadcasts and content that has been captured in 8K. Theoretically, even back to the Rio Olympics in 2016 in Brazil, there was content that was captured in 8K, but there's no distribution mechanism for this content yet, right? Because we were talking about a raw 4K video being 3 gigabits per second. Now we want to bump that up and 4 times that. We're over 12 gig of data for this raw 8K content. And if Netflix and Amazon are saying that you need to be between 15 and 25 megabits per second for your data pipe to do 4K, then if we assume that it's going to be 4 times that for 8K, and it's not a 1-to-1 translation, so it may be less than that, but even if it's double, then you're going to need, at a minimum, 50 megabytes per second of your data pipe coming in for one single video stream, and that you can't fit that in a 38.8 meg QAM distribution wrapper. So we're going to need to have a jump forward in compression algorithm or a jump forward in distribution technologies in order to support actual 8K video content being displayed in the broadcast world. That it's just, we're not there yet. And there are some things that are on the horizon. There's an H.266 versatile video codec, which I covered in the last webinar. That's on the horizon here and should see some hardware implementations by 2021, 2022. There are other codecs for OTT streaming that are above and beyond H.264 and HEVC that are going to be possible here and are going to be potentially the mechanism that we can use to distribute 8K content over the internet with your Amazon and your Netflixes of the world. But that none of that is here yet. All of that is in testing phase, and we're still kind of trying to figure that out. So my advice here, and it seems to be backed up by the experts in the industry that we'll send out in the links to this webinar, is don't go running out and buy that $8,000 8K TV just yet. You don't have a whole lot to play on. There's just not a lot of content out there right now that is going to support that 8K content and is going to validate the amount of money that you're going to spend in order to be able to get the 8K television. It might be a nice showpiece for your friends, and if you're just one of those people that absolutely loves to be on the leading edge of technology and show off the fancy new things that you get, then by all means, have at it. You do you. Let's live your life the way you want to live your life. But don't expect to be able to run out and play a bunch of actual 8K content on that 8K TV after you unwrap it underneath the Christmas tree in a month. It is going to happen, but I think we're years away from broadcast content in 8K in the U.S. There's just too much to do in terms of infrastructure and capture equipment and storage. There's a lot. So right now, as far as what we see on the threshold and what our customers have to plan for over the next 3 to 5 years, we're looking more at a transition to 4K than we are at a transition to 8K, barring some technological breakthrough that people are working on right now that they're not broadcasting to everybody else. And that's pretty much it. I mean, that's the tour through 4K, 8K, HDR, and where they're at. Again, I expect to see more 4K content out and about. Expect to see a proliferation of that stuff. Expect to see more 8K content in the digital signage world, in video walls, in places where you can have these massive screens that can actually support 33 million pixels and give you some difference in video quality from your standard 1080 and 4K stuff. But don't expect it to peel into the broadcast world just yet. I think we're a couple of years away before we start having a serious discussion on what 8K video will be. So that is it on my end. I'll sit here for a minute or two and wait for questions. I'm going to launch the polls at this point in time. They're pretty similar to what we did last time. So I'm going to give you guys a minute for that one, and then I'll do the next poll, and then if there are no questions that come in, I will then kill the webinar. Right now, the one that I'm seeing is Ernie's HDR or OTT question, which is a good question. Thank you very much for that, Ernie. Would have glad you asked it when you did rather than at the end of the webinar. All right, we've kind of hit a cap there at 60% of people having voted, so I'm going to close that one and launch the second poll. And I'll give this one another 45 seconds as well, and then I've got some questions that are starting to come in, so I'll jump into answering questions while this is going on. I've got a question coming in about broadcast devices like the Ucrypt and the COM3000, any of those turnaround devices. Those turnaround devices, yes, will be able to support 4K content as long as what's being provided to them is 4K. So it is important to note with devices like the Ucrypt and the COM3000, the smart box, that they're not actually going to manipulate content, right? They're not changing the resolution. They're not even actually changing any compression or anything like that. So as long as what's being delivered to them is 4K, then you're good to go. If they're not getting 4K, then you're out of luck. They're not going to create 4K themselves. I did get a question as well. I'm going to close this poll about the webinar. There will be a link available to the webinar. I believe Chad or your account manager, whoever it will be, will send out follow-up information on this. And then the link to the webinar will be in that follow-up. So you can watch it back yourself. You can share it with friends if you found it interesting. Whatever you want to do with that. The caveat will be there that you have to put in, basically, I think it's your email address. I don't think you have to make a password or anything, but you do have to put in your email address to access the GoToWebinar link. Okay. And if there are no other questions, I am going to close this out. And thank you all very much for attending. I don't think we'll be back in December with one of these, but we will be back in January with another presentation. Thank you all very much.